All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started. It's 1:05, and I'm sure more people will join, so I'm going to keep it on the screen for a little bit as I introduce everyone. This is our third webinar in our summer series on special education. So we're very happy that you could be here today and learn about special education and your rights. We are having these series of webinars this summer to help to educate parents about their about the special education process and about your rights. And we feel that it's even more important now, given all the changes that are happening with the pandemic and distance learning and the uncertainty around, the school and the education that our kiddos are getting. So thanks again for joining us. Some of you may have heard Governor Newsom speak about an hour ago. He did a press conference or a press briefing, and that was good information to tune into if you did. Basically, he provided an outline of more rigorous standards that he's going to be implementing for his school districts when they're reopening. I don't have it all memorized, but I do know that he's going to have school districts hold public meetings. They have to have at least 2 public meetings to get input from parents and the families that attend the school about how distance learning should look. So for some school districts that are planning on reopening in just a couple weeks, that doesn't give them a whole lot of time to hold it, but that is the requirement. So that'll be interesting. One of the things he said is that the in-person school will actually be based on local health data. So it's not up to the individual districts to determine when they open. If there are COVID cases that in their county, they have to be off the state's monitoring list in order to reopen. And then once they're off the state's monitoring list, at that point, there can be local decisions that can be made about how and when to reopen and what that looks like. I know as of, I think July, maybe it was June, but 31 of 58 California counties were actually on the monitoring list. So the vast majority were on the monitoring list. So that means those counties would then have to open in a distance learning format, which a number of the big districts have already stated they are going to be opening that way. And then there was another thing that was mentioned, the learning continuity attendance plan. And that is what involves the public meetings to get the parent input about distance learning and stuff. But it also, the plan the school districts must submit must include details about when in-person instruction resumes to help the students who have experienced the significant learning losses due to school closures. And that districts must specifically address the needs of students with disabilities in special education, homeless students, English language learners, and low-income students in foster youth. So there is more emphasis being put on those student groups, which is important. So there are the California Department of Education is going to be holding a couple training sessions or webinars later this month to talk in detail about this distance learning, about the learning continuity and attendance plan. And I'm going to put in the chat toward the end of the meeting today, I'm going to put that link down. So if you guys want to register for that webinar, or at least get the link to it so you know where to find out that information, then you guys will have that as well. And I'll probably put that in an email I send out to you next week after this training as well. Okay, so let's see, move on here. All right. So thanks to know today's workshop, as you saw from that initial screen, you do have to choose your language. Bottom of the screen, the globe icon, English or Spanish, and then mute the original audio so you don't hear a secondary language station or channel. We will send you copies of the PowerPoint slides and any relevant material afterwards. So you will be receiving that next week. And we do record these webinars, and we'll send you a link to those recordings as well. We are trying to keep the focus on the content of the webinar and answering your questions. So that's why the mics are muted and the videos are turned off for all the attendees. Please use the question and answer feature to ask any questions, because that's what works best for us to monitor, to ensure that we've answered your questions, because all your questions are important. We do want to make sure that we have gotten to them. And if we don't get to all your questions, or you find that you have questions after the webinar is over, please do email us. Our contact information is on the last slide of the PowerPoint, and we're available. So you can feel free to email us and reach out to us about your specific situation. I'm Jennifer Lucas. I'm with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. We are an independent state agency that helps people with developmental disabilities and their families get the services they need. Most of our work looks like this, where we do education, training, outreach, but we also collaborate with other agencies and try to provide technical assistance, is what we call it, which is if families have questions about their rights, if they're having difficulties or they just want to learn more, whether it's special education related or regional center related or any number of things, that they can call and email us and we can provide that information. And there are 12 different regional offices in California. Our office is the Central Coast office. We cover 7 counties. I know many people participating today are not within the Central Coast area, which is totally fine, but just know that if you have additional questions or want to know what other trainings are happening locally in your area, that you should contact your regional office, the regional state council office. And the link is there on the 3rd bullet point. And who's presenting today? So Mary Paetso is a special education advocate in Monterey County. Jonathan Gush is a special education teacher in private practice in Ventura County. And both Mary and Jonathan are also part of our regional advisory committee, which is part of the State Council Central Coast offices. Regional Advisory Committee. I'm Jennifer Lucas. And then Stellar Larriman is a Spanish interpreter in Monterey County, and she is a longtime community collaborator with her office, so we really appreciate her assistance with this today too. And everyone's volunteering their time, and so we're very appreciative to everyone for helping out to put these webinars together. So I'm just going to dive in. Snapshot of special education. So special education laws are governed by a combination of California laws, the state laws, and the federal laws. It's important to know that state laws can't be less than federal laws. So federal laws always come in above, and then state laws can be, at least the baseline of federal laws, and then go above if they want to, right, and become broader. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a federal law. So that's what basically protects the students with disabilities and outlines what they're entitled to with their free and appropriate public education. Also in the least restrictive environment. And these are terms that you should have received an email from me yesterday, and one of the links was to terms and references, and that document spells out these terms that you'll hear repeatedly, but they're good to get familiar with. So FAPE, free and appropriate public education, least restrictive environment, and students are also entitled to an IEP annually or more often. So the IEP is a contract that you have with your school district to provide services that are unique to your child's needs. So it's all about the individual, and it's all about making sure they can access their education, make progress on their IEP goals. It's never one size fits all. The IEP is annually, but they can happen more often if the parent has a need or wants to request one. And of course, after this recent distance learning and then coming back into the new school year, I would say a good number of parents are going to be requesting IEP meetings, or should, to address their concerns and to address their students' progress or lack of progress, and any changes that need to be made. So special education is delivered through the IEP to basically close the gap between the student's present level of performance and their expected level of performance. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And then to be eligible for special education, students must meet one of 13 eligibility categories and also need special education and related services to benefit from their education. This is all determined through the assessment process. We did discuss the assessment process in our last webinar. If you weren't available to watch that webinar or join in, you can email me and I can send you a recording of that webinar too. So the IEP process, what does that look like? So the IEP process always goes in a specific order. And this is basically the order that you see on the screen. It starts with the assessments. The assessments are there to provide objective information and recommendations about your student. And the school district's required to assess in all areas of suspected disability. Again, we addressed that in the last week's webinar, so I'm not going to cover that too much. That leads to present levels of performance. So that is, where is the student now? What are their abilities currently? Where are they at? If they're struggling in a particular area, what is that baseline? You know, what's the starting point? That leads to goals and objectives. So you can't have goals and objectives without having good present levels of performance, because otherwise, how do you know what your student should be working on? How do you know what the goal should look like? Because goals are written for 12 months. So it's important to know where the starting point is and have that clearly spelled out, and then determine 12 months from now where that student should be. And that's how an IEP goal is generally written. Then the goals lead to the services. So if I have a goal of speech therapy and a certain articulation goal perhaps around speech therapy, then how much speech therapy service and or other services would I need as a student to help me achieve that goal in 12 months. Accommodations and modifications, also part of the IEP to enable the student to access their education and to support their disability. And then that ends in placement. So placement is a continuum. There's all sorts of options around placement, because it's not so much a place, a physical place, as much as how the services are built in around the student. And so we'll discuss that as well. Today we're doing present levels of performance, goals and objective, and services. And then at next week's webinar on the 24th, we'll cover accommodations and modifications and placement as well. So the idea is that each level leads to the next level. A repeating mistake that I have seen many parents make is jumping ahead into, let's say, services. So you think your student needs more speech therapy, but yet there hasn't been an assessment indicating that, or their present levels of performance are indicating that, or there's not a goal indicating that, right? Some families might think, oh, my student needs, you know, speech therapy 3 times a week. But maybe there's only one small speech therapy goal. And so those two things don't really equate. And so that's why it's important to understand the cycle of special education and understand how each step leads to the next step. So how to prepare for the IEP. Mutually agreeable time. So the IEP team, it's important for parents to be collaborative when deciding on the IEP date. Sometimes parents will say, oh no, I can't make that date, and don't offer any other dates. And in the end, if the schools tried to reach out to you enough times and you're just saying no to everything, they potentially might hold the IEP meeting without you, which is something we absolutely don't want. Parents are a key part of the IEP team, and your input is critical as a parent. And so when the IEP team, when you hear from the district of an IEP date, if that time and date doesn't work for you, your best course of action is to propose 2 or 3 alternative dates and times when you're available. Doing this in writing is always advisable. So having the dialogue, all the dialogue in writing versus phone calls or in person is really helpful as well, because that creates part of the paper trail that shows that you're being a collaborative part of the IEP team and that you want to attend the IEP meeting. Attending by Zoom is perfectly fine, especially now. We were used to, of course, before COVID, we were used to attending the IEP meetings in person and sitting around and discussing things that way. But times have changed. We have to adapt. And right now, IEP meetings are generally held via Zoom. And that works perfectly well. And you can record the meeting as well. So that's my second bullet point, actually. So if you plan to record the meeting, which every advocate will recommend that you do record your meeting, you have to give the district at least 24 hours written notice. An email is perfectly fine. So what I do when I go to my son's IEP meeting or beforehand is they send me the notice. Once we agree on the date, I email them back saying, you know, I'm in agreement and that I plan to record the meeting. And I also would like to receive copies of any assessments or the draft IEP or any other information that would be discussed at the IEP meeting at least 5 days prior to the IEP date. And that's the third bullet point. So the whole point of requesting the documentation and any assessments and the draft IEP is to just ensure that you are able to participate as fully as you can as a parent, because your participation is key and is required by law for you to be an involved IEP team member. It's important to be informed about what's going on, what recommendations are happening, and anything else around your student, and any proposed IEP goals that might be on the table. So those are the 3 things that I normally send in my emails to the school district for my son when I go to an IEP meeting beforehand is, you know, yes, this date works. I'm planning to record the meeting, and I would like copies of, you know, all this certain information at least 5 days prior to the IEP meeting so that I can fully participate. If you need an interpreter, you also want to notify the district as you are entitled to those accommodations as well. And the last bullet point is critical. So it's creating and sharing your own parent agenda. Sometimes parents make the mistake of relying too heavily on everyone else on the IEP team and not themselves. So as a parent, you are the expert on your child. And quite frankly, because of the distance learning that happened, you're even more of an expert in some regards, because you were the one at home working with your student on the distance learning. Their school placement, the school was at home. So you have firsthand knowledge about, you know, the data, their present levels, where they're at right now. And so it's important that you share an agenda prior to let the school know what your areas of concern are and what you want addressed at the IEP meeting. And this will help the IEP teams kind of stay be accountable for what you want to discuss as well. Also, leading up to the IEP team, of course, you want to review the previous IEP and updates on progress, and you want to do your research. And we'll get into that a little more on a later slide. And then the IEP team, the required participants are the student. They must be invited when they're 16 or older. Sometimes you start inviting students as early as middle school or even maybe a little younger in some cases to portions of the IEP. They don't need to be remaining for the entire IEP. If some parts of the IEP meeting are going to be discussing things that are uncomfortable and the student might not want to hear, then it's perfectly fine for them to just attend a portion of the meeting. But the student's an important member, especially at 16 and above, to be their own self-advocate and to start advocating for their needs in the IEP. You as the parent or the person with educational rights, of course, are a team member. An administrative designee, someone who with the district has a power to actually commit the resources that are needed to implement your student's IEP. At least one general education teacher should be included. At least one special education teacher should be present. And then the people who conducted the assessments. So if there was a psychologist who did a psych ed assessment, then they should be in attendance. Or if they're not available, then someone who's qualified to explain those assessments and the results. And then the students' related service providers. Are they getting speech therapy? Are they getting occupational therapy? Counseling services through the school? Any related service providers should also attend. And then lastly, anyone else who the parent invites. So this could be a friend, an advocate. If you have if your student or if your student served by the regional center, then the service coordinator with the regional center might attend as well. And in general, it's recommended that you do bring a friend or someone with you because it can be kind of intimidating to be at the IEP and be surrounded by basically district staff, and then you're there as the parent advocating for your child. So it does help to bring someone along. And also, if you want someone specific from the district to attend your student's IEP meeting, make sure to make that request in writing. Don't assume that they're going to be there. We know how district staff can be very busy and everyone's doing something different. And so it's important to make your request in writing for who you want to be at the meeting. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. The one thing I thought of this morning for the webinar is the IEP that we're talking about is a legal contract for you and the school district. And anything that is discussed at the meeting that relates to all the good things that we'll be talking about on today's webinar and next Friday's webinar need to be documented. As Jennifer did mention, you can record the meeting itself, but frankly, you would have to go to due process, which is another meeting that we'll talk about with everybody, to be able to utilize what was said on that recording to benefit yourself. So anything you talk about, anything that is meaningful for your child's evaluation, goals, placement services, it needs to be written and recorded on the IEP because it is that legal contractual document. So where we've been on this journey is we talked about, where is your child now in distance learning? That was back in June. And our last webinar was about assessments. And what we're gearing towards up today is to talk about how do we memorialize, how do we document this in a legal document where there's understanding all the way around at the IEP team for what a child can and cannot do. So a present levels of performance is that agreement. So if you see discrepancies based off of what a general education teacher says, the special education teachers, or even what you see at home, there needs to be discussion and agreement about that and documentation in the present levels of performance page. So from this, we develop the rest of the IEP. So there should be discussion of what can be done, what your child can't do, because that becomes the goals. You need to be able to identify how a child's access to education is impacted. So this goes back to what we discussed earlier of a gifted and talented student may not necessarily qualify for special education because they're able to access their education. Special ed law says there has to be some sort of impediment in order to qualify for special education. And there's a little parenthetical note there for preschoolers, a disability must affect participation in age-appropriate activities. So it could be coloring, playing with friends, following classroom directions, even if it's not just solely academic. So the plot page does bridge the original assessments, or in some cases a triennial assessment, the data collected from those assessments to classroom performance. So we do want it to be accurate. We do want it to drive information and goals. Next slide, please. All right, so typically we see IEP goals written for 12 months at a time because that's the legal minimum requirement for IEP teams to meet is once every year. Every once in a while, we might see cases where a behavioral goal might be written for a more shorter term period. I mean, there could be a interim placement goal. There could be a need to see if a behavior intervention is working. But even still, most IEP teams will write goals for 12 months out, basically saying a year from now, this is what we want the student to learn. Once we have those goals, as Jennifer mentioned, they do drive services. So if there is no goal written for an area of need, your child will not receive services. And so let's say you notice your child is having difficulty having conversations with peers, talk about that. Have a goal written. That's when your child would be eligible for speech services if they meet all the criteria. So this starts at the present levels of performance page. Bring your concerns, have them documented, and do have that thought out ahead of time. If you need to consult with somebody, maybe the teacher beforehand, go ahead, have some notes, because it is really intimidating to talk about this in a functional way because there are so many professionals in a room. It does help to be prepared. When you do look at goals, we call them SMART goals, which is basically an acronym that talks about all the components a goal must have. We want the goals to be specific, not vague. They need to be measurable, which means you need to have specific verbs in your goal. Again, with distance learning, we have to be careful that we don't inadvertently write goals for a student will click on a page and move to the next slide of the teacher's PowerPoint. That goal is not very helpful. There should be goals such as writing the answers to problems, writing a paragraph, tracing letters. That verb choice is very, very important. The more active the verb, the better progress you're going to see. A here stands for action words. Again, what is that verb? What are we measuring your child doing? Do not let an IEP goal ever say no, as in Johnny will know his multiplication facts. That's not measurable. The only way we can see that right now is through a functional MRI, and school districts are not paying for those. We need to be able to see some kind of demonstration of the skills. The R in SMART is for realistic and relevant, and that's where the state content standards come in. We do need to strike a balance between where students are functioning at their assessment level and the state level standards. That's not to say this is appropriate for all students, but we do want to see improvement that's mandated by law. So as you look at your goals, think about, is this going to help my child? There's even conversations, for our transition age students, 16 and higher. How are we going to teach them money management? Is it important to tell kids how to give change and count change still? Right now we have Kroger, the parent company of Ralph's, saying we're not giving change back because there's a shortage of change across the country. Many people use credit card, debit cards, and other EBT cards, SNAP benefits. That does not involve counting change. So do have that kind of realistic conversation of what is this goal for? Similarly, you might see goals are extremely easy, and you might have an elementary school student trying to learn the multiplication facts for years on an end. And if that goal is no longer relevant because progress hasn't made evident that there's learning happening on that goal, change the services or find a different goal that is going to work for your child. So in our example goal down here, we have beginning, middle, and end of a story, right? It's not just talking about the simple story itself, it's talking about specifically what is going on. So this would be a sequencing goal. Again, a really relevant goal because sequencing helps kids learn to follow directions. It helps them learn what needs to be done during the day, at what order. And there are just so many things in life that if you mess up the order, like getting dressed, you're not going to be in a good spot. The last item here on SMART goals is the T, time limited. And we do see this in a couple spots here. So there is that date that should align with the next annual or triennial IEP, just to make everybody's lives a little bit easier. And then you also see the end part of the goal with the 80% accuracy in 3 out of 5 trials. These numbers will vary based upon your child's needs. Accuracy, you probably want to shoot very high. Every once in a while, I'll come across goals myself that are like less than 50%. And if that's the case, you want to ask, why is the accuracy so low? You might need to find a more basic goal for the child or a part of the goal. So maybe in this case, it wouldn't just be the beginning, middle, and end. Maybe it's just identifying at the beginning. That would help the accuracy go up. The next part is the 3 out of 5 trials. What we're saying here is we don't want the child to do it once. We want the child to do it multiple times again and again and again. And this is especially important for our students with autism because we know that they need help generalizing the skills that they learn in one location to other settings as well. Next slide, please. So down here, we have some examples of exceptional goals. And the idea here was to provide as many different goals in different areas as possible. So you guys can take this and see how goals should be written across different disciplines. So the first example is by June 15, 2021, when given a set of 10 numbers, Jonathan will write the prime factorization with 80% accuracy as measured by student work samples. So again, we have a date, we have a what, we have the whom. So in this case, there's a name here. You want to make sure your goals are written for your child. Do mistakes happen? Yes, but that's part of the IEP team discussion. We have the accuracy and how we are going to track that. So in this case, it's student work samples. And you want to follow up with that with the IEP team. If they come in with just data, oh, here's a teacher's grade book, you can go, well, I thought we were going to see the work. Numbers themselves don't tell us alone how a child actually completes their work. The next goal is for a fluency goal. And you can see it's basically the same thing. We have specifically the grade level of a story. We have a number. And this time, what you see is a difference in how we can collect data. So this time, we are talking about data. It says right there. We can also record the student reading a passage. And this could be very helpful too, because you might notice your child is not very fluent. Maybe there's a lot of pauses. Maybe there's strange inflections that take away from the meaning of the story. So a video is also a really interesting way of collecting data. And it doesn't have to be just academics. This could also carry over to behavior goals as well. The next goal here is writing. And I put this goal here on our slide because writing is truly the hardest academic area to teach. There's so much that goes into it. So when you look at your writing goals, do take a look at what the expectation is. So this one is for an organizing goal. It's helping children develop their language. It's not actually writing the paragraph. So take a look, see where your child's needs are. Maybe they're fine motor and they need help holding their pencil or pen. Maybe it's language-based like this goal is addressing. They need help just getting the ideas out and organized. Maybe it's an executive functioning goal where they just need that help making the time to finish a writing assignment. There are many, many different goals to help with writing. Lastly, we hope to be able to follow up on a behavior series. I did want to talk about behavior goals briefly. Anytime your child has a behavior plan, whether it's a positive behavior support plan or a full-on behavior analysis with a BIP, a behavior intervention plan, you need 2 behavioral goals. And that's to help monitor the problem behavior that we're trying to help the child avoid and the replacement behavior of what we're trying to teach your child to do differently. We want to monitor both. Next slide, please. All right, so baseline and progress reporting. This is the most important part. We want to know where your child currently stands. So if you're at an IEP meeting and you propose a new goal, you're likely to get some pushback because the IEP team member will have to go back and re-baseline the goal. And that's basically a trial of, okay, we want to teach your child this. How well are they doing at this now? For example, it could be multiplication facts. Maybe the goal is they want your child to memorize their multiplication facts 0 through 12. Well, maybe they're only working on the zeros, the ones, and the 2. That would be your baseline. What you want to see is consistency. If you're talking about a multiplication goal, the baseline should be about multiplication. If it talks about division, adding, subtracting, the baseline does not match the goal. So that's not appropriate. Lastly, if you look at the assessment data that is done in an assessment, it does not directly translate over to the goal itself. The goal should be based on data from a task that is done in the classroom. An assessment is just a snapshot. It's not going to help you with the full classroom performance and what they will be teaching your child. The other thing too is you're entitled to progress reports at the same frequency the school notifies everybody else of grades. So elementary schools typically are on a trimester schedule now. That would mean your child needs to have progress reporting done 3 times a year. Should it be around progress report time for report card time? Yes. Does it always happen that way? Unfortunately, no. But you should still have 3 progress reports if you're on a trimester system. If you're on a quarter system, you should get it 4 times a year. High schoolers typically get it every semester with the final grade report cards. All right, lastly, schools may try to pull some funny things, unfortunately. I have a couple of my students that are on my caseload come back with progress reports going, we can't assess present levels of performance. And I'm not exactly clear where the law is going to fall on that one, because there were no waivers for special education during distance learning. It kind of is appearing that if a school district does say that they are basically admitting that they did not provide services to help your child establish educational benefit. So do follow up with that. We will have a webinar a couple weeks out on how to manage those issues. The other reason you may not receive a progress report is if your child is absent several times, or if the behavior impacts learning. And if you do get a progress report that says your child's behavior impacts their learning, you do need to follow up with behavioral supports and behavioral interventions to get your child learning, which is the sole premise of an IEP. All right, next slide, please. All right, and Mary, I believe this is where you're picking it up, right?
Sure.
Can I just mention something real quick to all of you guys who are entering questions in the chat in Spanish? We don't have the ability to translate that quickly and then get back to you in chat. The only person who speaks Spanish is actually the one doing the interpretation, and so she's unable to go back and forth. But we will try to address them during the question and answer portion of this webinar. And if we aren't able to get to them, then like I said, you can certainly follow up with us by email as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And I wanted to say also that as far as recording IEP meetings go, I always record every meeting that I go to, just to have that hard recording and documentation of what actually was discussed at that IEP meeting, because time and time again, when I see IEPs and I read the notes, and then they are written so vaguely that if you're not there in that meeting, you really don't know what was said or what was talked about. And a lot of times too, during the meeting, you think that they're telling you one thing, and then you go back and you get home and you start asking them about it, and they're like, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I said. If you have that recording, you can quote it directly from the recording, play it back for them, and just say, well, that's what you said in the meeting. I have it on a recording. It is always, always, always a good idea to record your IEP meetings. Even if you have a great relationship with your IEP team and you've got the world's best IEP team, always record. And like Jennifer said, you have to give 24 hours written notice to the district that you will be recording, and they automatically will record the meeting as well, so that they have their own recording of the meeting, so that everybody has the same information. So don't be alarmed if you give notice that you're going to be recording and they say, oh, well, we're going to record too. That's common protocol. So, okay, services are based on the IEP goals. If your child has an IEP goal for speech, that, you know, he will pronounce certain letter combinations, or speech therapists typically, not always, but typically do social skills training as well for students, and run social groups, because speech is considered, or social skills is considered as part of speech. Then your child should have goals, or should have minutes written in their IEP for speech services to work on those goals. Same with occupational therapy. If your child has a goal that he will write with the correct pencil grasp, then there should be an occupational therapy goal to reflect that and to measure the progress. You can't measure progress without goals, which is why I don't like to see students who need goals on 504 plans, because I've never been able to get a district to write goals into a 504 plan. I've been able to get them to write one-on-one aids and other things into a 504 plan, but you can't get goals under a 504 plan. Or maybe some of you have been able to do that, I don't know, but I never have. And you always want to measure progress. If you're not measuring progress, then you don't have data to show that your child is making progress. And if they're not making progress towards their goals, then they're not receiving a free and appropriate public education. Or if your child's in the general ed curriculum and not making progress in there, then your child's not receiving a free and appropriate public education. And services should also be provided so that the student can participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities, like field trips. I've seen situations where the district relies on the parent to come on every single field trip because they don't want to provide staff personnel to ensure that a child is safe on the field trip. And services should help the student be educated and should help the student be able to participate with all of the other students in the classroom or on the field trip or wherever they are. The services should facilitate inclusion and not exclusion. Sometimes we see situations where a student simply needs something like a one-on-one aid to facilitate on-task work in the classroom, but the district doesn't want to provide that. Instead, they want to put the student in a special day class, and it's not an appropriate setting for the child. Well, that's not inclusion, and that's not educating the student in his or her least restrictive environment. And the services must be needed to provide a free and appropriate public education. As was said earlier, the disability must adversely affect the student in order to be eligible for an IEP and for the services. If your student doesn't have a need for social skills training or speech therapy, then the district isn't going to give your child that service. There has to be a demonstrated need for it. Okay, next slide. And services can include, but are not limited to, things such as audiology or interpreter services. If you have a parent who is deaf or hard of hearing and they communicate via sign language, then the district needs to have a sign language interpreter at the IEP meeting to facilitate parent participation. The same goes with Spanish, Farsi, French, in any language that the parent speaks as a first language. And if they do not speak English fluently, the district needs to provide interpreter services for that meeting, and also the IEP documents in that parent's native language. Same goes for Braille. If the student is blind and needs the books in Braille, the district needs to provide that. If the student needs counseling services, the district needs to provide that. Districts contract out to county mental health agencies to bring in therapists to come work with students in the school setting. If the student needs early identification and assessment of disabilities, the district is responsible for that under Child Find. If the student needs medical services to determine eligibility, the district needs to provide that. If the student needs school health services for health-related needs, the district needs to provide that. If the student, for example, has a seizure disorder and they need to have a school nurse on campus to administer rescue meds in case he has a seizure, the district needs to provide that, or at least some type of protocol in place and trained personnel to provide the rescue meds. If a student needs occupational therapy, the district has to provide that. Orientation and mobility services, the district needs to provide that. And the district, many parents don't know this, but the district also needs to provide parent counseling and parent training. So if you do not understand the IEP process or the IEP itself, the district needs to provide training for the parents so that you are able to understand that. And other services are physical therapy, psychological services, recreation, rehabilitation, counseling services, social work services in school, speech language pathology services, transportation. Many parents don't know this either. If your child is sent to a special day class that's not your neighborhood school, the district needs to provide transportation to and from that school. Interpreter services, a transition specialist. If you have a student who is 16 years old or older, the district needs to provide transition assessments and transition services and transition goals in your child's IEP. Ideally, you want to start earlier than age 16, but the California Ed Code says age 16, they must do it. Next slide, please. Okay, services continued. The service page is part of the IEP contract, so read it carefully. It shows who's providing the service, the minutes, how many minutes will be provided, whether it's push in or pull out. Push in is the service provider going into the classroom and working with the student in the classroom. Pull out is when they have the student typically go to the resource room or the speech therapist's office or the OT's office, and they do the service minutes in there. And it also should state whether the service is direct one-on-one, which means the provider working solely with the student. If it's group, what I see a lot of is small group, which, is that 3 other kids? Is that 10 other kids? What is that? That's not well defined. It's vague. Or consult. And then if it's group, is that in the classroom or is that in the therapist's office or the resource room? It should state that in the IEP. And then if it's consult, is that happening in the classroom in front of the other students? Or is that happening, outside of regular teaching hours? And not only that, but who are they consulting with? Are they consulting with the general ed teacher, the resource teacher? You need to know all this before you sign the IEP. And then it also has the end dates for the services, which are usually 1 year out from the IEP date, to give them sufficient time to work on the goals. And it's the students' needs that drive the goals and drive this, and the goals drive the services. So if your student has needs in particular areas, you need to make sure that they get goals in those areas. And then extended school year is an IEP team decision. You want to have data or an assessment that shows that your child will regress without extended school year services. And most parents call it summer school, but it's not summer school. It's technically different from summer school. And you want to start taking data at the beginning of the school year. There's usually Thanksgiving break is about 5 days long. If you notice a regression in your child after that, then document it, write down what you see. And then there's winter break, which is usually 2, I think some districts have 3 weeks off. Document what you see when your child goes back to school, and the same with spring break. And then, if you see regression happening after winter break, you can request an IEP meeting specifically to talk about extended school year services and share the data that you have with the IEP team. They may say, well, let's see what happens after spring break, and we can meet again after that and then decide. And then also what I see sometimes is that with budget cuts happening, not every district has their own ESY program. But if your child needs ESY, they can't say no to it just because they don't have an appropriate program. You're going to have to do some legwork and go find an appropriate ESY program for your child and go back to the district and say, I found this program. Sometimes it's in a neighboring district. Sometimes it's a private program, and just say, I found this program. He needs this. Can we do this? And it's usually 4 weeks, and it's during the summer. And I think that and it's not a full school day. It usually runs, I think, 3 or 4 hours a day. And then also, if your child is getting services, those services can be included in extended school year services as well. It's not just academics. Next slide, please. Oh, And that's an important thing too. If you're not sure what services your child has received or is getting, you have the right to request a copy of the logs from the therapists that are seeing your child, like the speech therapist and an occupational therapist. You'll have to make that request directly from the therapist because they keep their own logs and their own files on the students that they work with. But they should be able to give you a copy of that. And then you can see for yourself, you know, how many times, what days they have seen your child. Free and appropriate public education, commonly referred to as FAPE. In a nutshell, it's an individualized education program that is designed to meet the child's unique needs and from which the child receives educational benefit and prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living. We recently, in 2017, had further definition of what educational benefit means in the Andrew F. case, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's an individualized educational program, which means that there's no sorting and grouping, that it's not one size fits all. It should be and needs to be individualized to your child's specific needs. And the child should be receiving educational benefit, meaning that he or she should be making progress. He or she should be meeting their IEP goals and moving up in the grades. And then preparing them for further education, employment, and independent living. This is where transition plans come in. And as I said earlier, the California Ed Code says that California students, once they turn age 16, they must have a transition plan in place. They must have goals towards that plan. So make sure that those goals are adequate goals so that your child will be ready for whatever comes next after high school. The IEP goals must be aligned with grade level state academic content standards. If a child's performing below grade level, he or she needs to receive specialized instruction, and the IEP team needs to develop annual goals to close the gap. So if your child is not performing at grade level, say you have a 10th grader reading at a 5th grade level, your child should be receiving specialized instruction in reading, and the IEP team should develop annual goals to help your child make progress. And by making progress, if he starts out his 10th grade year reading at a 5th grade level and ends his 10th grade year reading at a beginning 6th grade level or late 5th grade level, that is not adequate progress because he's only gained a year in a year. So he's still going to be a year behind. So the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive educational benefit. Next slide, please. And Andrew F. was a Supreme Court decision in 2017. Andrew was a boy with autism who made almost no progress on his IEP goals because his behavioral and academic needs were not addressed. And I believe he had the same goals year after year. The parents thought he should have an equal opportunity to achieve success like the other kids in the school. And they argued that the school district argued that he only had the right to a minimal benefit from his IEP because nobody had defined what educational benefit was yet. And prior to this case, it was interpreted that as long as he made minimal benefit, or which is almost nothing, that he was benefiting from his IEP. So the decision on this case did not change the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but it did help to clarify the meaning of what FAPE is. And what that is that IEP goals must be aligned with grade level standards for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Schools must still provide challenging content but may use alternative academic standards determined on an individual basis. The IEP must be reasonably calculated to help your child make progress. The IEP must include behavioral services and supports that your child needs in order to learn. If your child needs a behavior intervention plan, or if the school needs to do a functional behavior assessment to figure out why he's off task all the time, then that's what they need to do. The school must have a compelling explanation for why the services in the IEP will help your child make progress. So they need to be accountable for why they're giving your child these services. As a parent, you help decide whether the IEP has the input it needs to be appropriate for your child. Like, say you think your child needs social skills training because he has no friends, he interprets things very literally, doesn't get implied meanings, and the school says, no, we don't see that. He talks to kids in the classroom, he's fine. You have the right to request a speech evaluation to test his language skills, which also means his expressive and receptive language skills, which if he does need the service, that assessment should show that that he's eligible for those services, that there is a discrepancy receiving. You can straight and the IEP should be ambitious about your child's future and what can be accomplished. The goals should be adequate to your child's cognitive abilities, and they should be ambitious. Your child must have the chance to meet challenging objectives, which means that the school should not have low expectations for your child. They should challenge your child and not let him stagnate, basically. I mean, if you have a fifth grader that's functioning at a first grade level, that is not, the school is not challenging your child, and he probably does not have ambitious goals. Because if the goals are ambitious, you see progress. Next slide, please. And advocacy tips, know your rights. There's a website address there that you can go to that has some good information on parents' rights. Bring a friend, advocate, or someone who knows your child. This is a really good idea, just because they can help keep you calm. And I know parents a lot of times feel overwhelmed and outnumbered at IEP meetings when you're sitting around a table with 8 or 10 people from the school district and it's just you. It's nice to have a friendly face at the table with you. Ask questions throughout the IEP meeting. If you don't understand something, speak up and ask them to explain it. Questions are good and collaborative, and try not to make accusations, and I recommend that you don't yell. I like to say that you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, so it's good to keep your cool. I know it's hard sometimes. Help to encourage the discussion that's taking place in the IEP meeting. And you can sometimes change the mind of the listener if you come in and you're calm and you have data and you can say, this is what I see, this is what's happening. And then sometimes, you can persuade the team to see other things that maybe they overlooked. And top IEP mistakes, failing to attend. That's a big one. If you can't make it, call them and reschedule it. You have a voice, and it's a very important voice, and you need to use it for the benefit of your child. Failing to question authority. It's okay to question them. they're people too. And you should question them because they're working with your child and you want your child's needs to be met. Failing to prioritize, that's a big one too. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, and you can't work on everything all at once and make progress in every single area. If your child needs one thing more than other things, I'm not saying don't work on the other things, but mainly focus on that one area. Like if your child has behavioral issues, focus on the behavioral issues and get those under control, and then start working on the other issues, because you can't really work on the other issues until you get the behaviors under control. It makes it very difficult. Failing to prepare. You want to make sure that you request a draft of the IEP or any assessment reports prior to the IEP meeting. If they'll give them to you 5 days before, that's great. A lot of times I get them the day before or even hours before. But it helps to review it before the meeting. It helps you write down some questions and start formulating questions that you have. I think it's always a good idea, and it just helps facilitate the meeting being more successful and productive. And it's okay to ask to take a break. A lot of times parents get emotional in IEP meetings because we love our kids, and it's hard to hear these things sometimes that school district personnel say about our kids. And if you need to take a 5 or 10 minute break, or even if the meeting has just gone on longer than anticipated and you need a break, it's okay to ask for a break. And then I like to put like a 2.5 hour time limit on my IEP meetings. I feel like they stop becoming productive after that point. Everybody's too tired. And I feel like if there's still a lot more to talk about, that we can't wrap it up in an extra 10 minutes, that I'll request that we continue the meeting at a further date. And then, parents have time to process what was discussed in that meeting. And then we go into part 2 of the IEP meeting in a fresh mental state instead of carrying on for 3 or 4 hours. And next slide.
Okay, thanks, Mary. All right, so now is our Q&A time, and I know there's been a lot of questions coming in. I meant to actually only have you guys answer or ask the questions in the question and answer feature, but I know there's questions in both the chat area and the Q&A feature, so we're going to try to go through and make sure that we've addressed those questions. I know some that came in Spanish we weren't able to get to, but we got to some of them, I think, with Google Translate. This slide is for the upcoming webinars. We have 3 more left in our series for the next 3 Fridays. So if you haven't registered for those, you can use the link here, and you can also just email me directly, Jennifer Lucas. My email's I think in the chat log, and it's here too. And let me know which ones you want to register for. Next week will be the rest of the IEP process and your rights. The following week would be on the complaint and due process, what to do when there's a dispute with the school. And then the last webinar will focus more on just discussing what's going to be happening, what do things look like for the new school year, trying to get the latest information out there. And probably less of a presentation and more of a Q&A on that one. So we'll see. So anyway, we can go ahead and dive into the questions. Jonathan, do you want to start? And this is our contact information. Should anyone want to follow up with any of us individually, you can do so by shooting us an email. So I'm going to go ahead and let Jonathan, I think there was a couple questions we received prior, so we're going to go ahead and address those first, and then try to address the other questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we received several questions based off of the enrollment form that you filled out to get the link here, specifically about instructional aids or the one-on-one aids that many students had prior to the distance learning. And it's important to remember Betsy DeVos and the Federal Department of Education did not issue any waivers to special education. So these are school staff members that are hired by the local school districts. We don't know where all of them are. However, it's also important to realize schools cannot force their staff members to go into family homes to provide services. So as you're looking at your child at home, you do need to figure out, okay, what is working and what is not working. There tends to be only certain reasons why one-on-one aids are given in the first place. And it's really important to stop and think, okay, well, why do I have an aid for my child? Once you break apart and understand the needs, it is much easier to communicate with the school why an aid still might be relevant in the distance learning environment. So the first reason tends to be health and or personal care. So if there is a health plan, maybe your child has epilepsy, CP, or some other health condition that requires an adult assistance to be around your child just for health reasons, you might want to talk about the school district of how maybe even you can be compensated for providing that service during distance learning activities. Many parents expected the school district to be able to carry that out during the school day, and now that is in their lap at home for parents to manage. So that is a very large transfer of burden from the school to the family. So if your child has health needs during distance learning, talk to the school district and how that can be supported. The next reason is behavior. Typically, those kids that have behaviors at school are seen as needed instructional support for various purposes, for teaching. Maybe there's an issue or an IEP team says, oh, we need a kid to be restrained by a staff member in case of emergency, and they give the child an aid. Obviously, if a child has behaviors only at the school and they're distance learning, there isn't that need for an aid. However, the behavior does come from somewhere, and understanding why a child misbehaves is part of a whole process. Part of a functional behavior analysis is part of ABA, and learning to understand from a child who's acting out is a long process. So if your child had aid services before, you might need to utilize those aid services again to help you figure out why your child is engaging in a certain behavior at home. So it may not be the one-on-one aid, because those are typically a classified staff member, not somebody that has been trained or it has a college degree. But do talk about the problems you're facing, especially if you can't help your child access the school activities, whether it's they're not sitting in the chair, they're running away, crying. There might need to be a change of other services, such as counseling and guidance, speech services, to help your child where they are now. Instructional needs is also another section of why a student would have a one-on-one aid. It could be your child has motor skills issues, and maybe they have like a lot of Velcro-based manipulatives to help them communicate, or they communicate through a picture exchange communication system, PECS, some other augmentative communication, and an aid would facilitate that. Again, somebody at home would probably be having to assist at that and have that conversation of how that service can be bridged by a family member, not necessarily the school. The last section for an aid is for inclusion. And again, schools are closed for this, but document your concerns of what your child can and cannot do for distance learning. Bring it to the school's attention of what is happening and how you may need support at home. Many schools are coming to terms with not every child can access distance learning in a group. And I do think some schools are recognizing that and making contingency plans to have some staff members available for one-on-one instruction. And we'll be talking about that more on the webinar next week on how to write services. And as Mary talked about this time, why the setting is so important if it's individual or group. Let's see, and then where did the other question go? We had another question about services only being provided on a consultation basis and who should be providing the consultation. So if your services include consult, they need to come from the credentialed person that the service provider is able to provide. So what that means is if you have academic consultation, it needs to come from a credentialed special education teacher with the right credential. Same thing with speech consultation. It should be coming from the speech pathologist, not necessarily a speech pathologist assistant. You need to go to the source. It should not be coming from any classified staff member, which would mean like a paraprofessional or an aide. The teacher is ultimately responsible for their paraprofessional, just like a speech pathologist would be responsible for the SLPA or the speech pathology assistant. Within that question, it's also referring to, is a consultation still appropriate? And if your child is not making progress towards their goals as written, then no, a consultation service model is still not appropriate. You need to have conversations with the IEP team on how to provide more restrictive services. So it could be a push into the classroom to help the child succeed, or if they need something more intense, such as maybe a pull out to the resource room. Of course, those are pre-COVID examples. Even with distance learning, I would expect school districts to be planning for these kinds of scenarios when a student needs a more intensive type of intervention than what a teacher would be scheduling for them. All right, Mary?
Thank you, Jonathan. We had a couple other questions. One is how to ask to increase minutes for services provided. So say, for example, you want to increase your child's minutes for speech therapy. Well, it depends. You could either take your own data, which you could do easily right now because schools are closed, and call an IEP team meeting and then share that data with the team and ask for more speech services. Or if the district has assessed your child in the area of speech and language within the last 2 years, you can request an independent evaluation at public expense and get your own private evaluation done, and then share the results of that with the IEP team and ask for more minutes, assuming that that evaluation supports your view that your child needs more speech minutes. If the district has not assessed your child in speech and language in the last 2 years, you'll need to request a new speech assessment from the district and wait and see what that says. I know that districts are telling a lot of parents that they're not doing assessments right now. There's no waiver from IDEA to support that. So you can bring that up and let your district know that. And I know that there are some private providers out there who are doing assessments during this time. The governor has deemed people such as assessors and school psychologists as essential workers. So you'll just have to call around and find out and find somebody who's currently doing assessments to do an independent evaluation for you. And then I have another question here. I asked for an IEP from the school since March 2nd, 2020. And on May 25th, I sent a text message to the principal to ask for an IEP again. And they already sent my daughter to a school that we did not ask for. If they changed your daughter's placement and you did not sign an IEP allowing that to happen, you should file a compliance complaint with the California Department of Education, because they are in violation of IDEA and the California Ed Code. If you did sign the IEP for placement, then they have the right to move her there. And if you're requesting an IEP meeting and they're just not responsive, you can also file a compliance complaint for that. I would attach any documentation that you have showing that you made the request, like a copy of the text message, or any other emails that you have sent requesting an IEP meeting. And I would continue to request an IEP meeting until they hold one. But yeah, definitely file a compliance complaint regarding that, because the California Department of Education can force them to hold an IEP meeting. And most districts are doing them online now anyways, and not doing them in person. So there is really no excuse for them not to do it. All right, and that's it for me.
Okay, I'll answer a couple questions that came in as well. And Jonathan, I know you're looking through some of the chat, and Mary too, probably. I know some stuff came in Spanish, so maybe we can Google Translate some of those and address those live as well. So one of the questions that came in previously was, let's see, students' rights under IDEA during the distance learning when the student doesn't have the resources to connect through an online device and receive those services. So kind of mentioned that at the very beginning about the learning continuity and attendance plan that's in place now in the state of California, which is all about ensuring that students have the laptops and the Wi-Fi that they need. In June, the CDE said that there were at least 700,000 laptops needed and 322,000 Wi-Fi hotspots needed to connect all the students from home. So there is a statewide task force collecting money to basically address that need. So it's definitely a need. Since you have a student with an IEP, that is an extra layer of protection. So one recommendation that I would make is putting the need in the IEP. Assistive technology is a service that can be added into the IEP if it helps the student benefit from their learning. Any device, high tech or low tech, that enables the student to access their education and benefit from learning. So certainly if they're distance learning, they need the connectivity through Wi-Fi and they need the device. That works for them because everybody's different. The other question that came in was that if distance learning is not working at all, which unfortunately was the case for many of our kids, and that in-person instruction is needed to make progress on IEP goals, but that the districts refuse to do that, what are the options available? And I think it's important, obviously, obviously the in-person instruction is completely based on health and the county and the new guidelines being laid out by the governor on when schools can provide in-person learning. So that can't necessarily be forced, but there are some flexible things. And so one of the things that has come up is that that there's probably a certain number of face-to-face hours that teachers are going to be required to provide with their students. So it might not be identified in the time, but I do believe it's supposed to be every day. There's supposed to be some sort of face-to-face, which can be online time with the students. And so that might be something you would want to specify in your student's IEP, because remember, the IEP is an extra level of protection for students. So if they have one, then it's important to utilize the IEP process and actually put in things that are specific to what the student would benefit from with distance learning, like what services need to be put in place or what tweaks and modifications need to be made to help them benefit from distance learning. And so it might be a certain amount of time with face-to-face teacher interaction. It might be a specific online learning program that they benefit from. Maybe not all students, because remember, the I is individual, so it's about your student. Maybe they need individual counseling services to address anxiety or frustration. And again, maybe that you as the parent might need some specific training to enable you to better support your student with distance learning as well. So there's all different ways to go about this. Keep in mind, if you have your student has an IEP, that you should utilize that process, because that is a legal contract, so it's binding. So identifying your student's needs and determining what changes need to be made and put in services into the IEP is really the number one thing you guys can do as parents. And then, of course, communicating everything in writing with the school. So if there are issues, there are things that are not working, and I know this came through the chat a few times. When something's not working, which a lot of things didn't work during the end of this past school year, that needs to be documented, right? Nobody's going to be a mind reader. So get that stuff in writing, put an email together outlining what worked, what didn't work, and any recommendations you as the parent might have to make things better. And that way you've put kind of the responsibility in the school's court to address it. But that's the first step. The second step, obviously, is having an IEP meeting to follow up on all that documentation and to make changes to the IEP to ensure that your student can access their learning and make progress on their goals this coming school year. And also that would help with the documentation, would help should you be needing compensatory, or your student should be needing compensatory services. Okay, so Mary or Jonathan, are there any questions you want to read out loud and answer that have come in through chat or the Q&A?
Yes, we just had a question come in from Yvonne about her student not having any goals after an FBA was completed with the 101 behavior plan. And the answer is you have to get goals. Any area of need needs goals. Goals help an IEP team determine if progress is being made. And if you find yourself that the school district is refusing to write a goal, that's when you refuse to sign and ask that a goal be written to help your son's behavioral needs. Again, you want the replacement behavior to be a goal by itself. So maybe it's asking for a break. And then you want the other goal to track what the problem behavior is and to make sure that behavior is happening less often and that your son is using the replacement behavior.
Hey, Jonathan, can I interrupt real quick?
Can I say something real quick?
I just want to say the poll is up. So for those of you that see the poll on your screen, please do respond to it. It helps us understand how we're doing. We want to hear from you, and there's just like 5 very brief questions, so you can quickly answer it, and then it closes the window. And feel free to keep asking your questions. Okay, Mary, sorry.
Or you can request an independent evaluation at public expense for a functional behavior assessment to be done, and you can find your own qualified person to do the assessment. Usually you want to find a board certified behavior analyst to do it because they have the right credentials and they know a lot about behaviors, and ask them to write a goal in the areas that you see that he needs them, because if you see that he needs them, then most likely they will too. So you definitely have a right. Not a lot of parents understand that they have a right to request an independent evaluation at public expense in the area of a functional behavior assessment as well.
And I'm just noticing it's 2:30. So our stop time, or it's actually after 2:30, 2:34, our stop time is 2:30. But Jonathan and Mary, if you have time to answer a few more questions, and Stella, if you're available for a few more minutes.
I have about 5 more minutes, yeah.
Okay, so we'll, yeah, go ahead and feel free to share some more questions and answers.
I will definitely say there is a common theme of the goals. Working with goals, it's important to have that verb choice there. We had a parent ask earlier of what happens if your student can't sit in front of a computer all day long. I would expect school districts to be able to provide some alternative means to computer-based instruction, even if it's mailing home manipulatives and worksheets that are accessible. You know, I made a reference earlier to maybe some Velcro-based activities, maybe it's fine motor activities from an occupational therapist. Do reach out and look at the goals, look at the verbs of the goals, because sitting in front of a computer is not a needed goal. Let's see. A couple questions came in about ABA. Typically in the school context, ABA is not usually discussed because it is a strategy for a behavioral intervention, not necessarily as specific as a goal needs to be. So if your child does have behavioral needs, this is when the goals become very, very important. The goals are what we want to have the child achieve. ABA is the strategy by which school staff members would help your child meet those goals. And there's a variety of services. Sometimes it's a behavioral intervention. Sometimes it's a behavioral consultation. Sometimes it could even just be the school psychologist. But ABA as a strategy cannot be documented within a goal. It could be on the accommodations page, which we'll talk about next week as well. Let's see. Mary, there's a couple of questions that came in about parent training. Did you want to clarify that for the families?
Sure. Actually, the state of California has certain designated places that are parent training centers. I think Parents Helping Parents in San Jose is one. And that's their whole function is to work with parents and train them so that they understand the IEP process and can make informed decisions and advocate effectively for their own kids.
And the trainings are free?
Yes, the trainings are free.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap up just to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We will be having part 2 of the IEP process next Friday, so we hope you can join us.